well. And this is an essay by Martin Heidegger. It's from a collection of essays called Poetry and Thought. So this one is going to take up probably the bulk of the reading, I hope. It's lengthy, it's quite dense. But before we get to that, there's a couple of background readings that I want to just kind of look at briefly. And that's just to lay the groundwork for reading Heidegger, which needs a little bit of preparation. And so you'll find, I put it all in order in the packet. The first one is called Wit and Mystery, a reevaluation in medieval Latin hymnody. Right? That's going to be looking at St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas's kind of aesthetics, his philosophy of poetry. And the next one is called Comments on Poetry and Theology by Dominican Father Paul Murray. And that one's going to be add a little bit to the prior one. Thanks. Then following that, there's this essay called From Existentialist Aesthetics. So just to kind of lay out the game plan, we'll start with St. Thomas. Okay, we're going to look at the classical aesthetics, or the classical understanding of poetry. By the classical, I mean the Thomistic. So we'll look at St. Thomas. Then from St. Thomas, we're going to go over here and we'll look at the existentialists, which is one of the different modern aesthetic theories into which Heidegger is usually grouped. But I would like to, well, never mind. I won't say that now. After we've looked at those two, we'll look at Heidegger. And as we read through the essay by Heidegger, keep in mind what we've looked at from St. Thomas and from the existentialist aesthetics, okay, and kind of look for those threads in Heidegger to see whether he falls more into the existentialist camp or follows more closely St. Thomas. He's usually grouped with the existentialists, but it's an open question, right?
Did he himself deny it?
Who? Martin Heidegger?
That Heidegger himself didn't claim that category.
Well, I think on a couple occasions he may have denied being an existentialist, but most of the existentialists did. So that's one of the jokes in philosophy. You can tell an existentialist because they'll tell you they aren't one. Oh, that's fun. But so anyway, that's an open question. We'll get to that soon. Then at the end of our time tonight, which I believe is 90 minutes, about. So as we approach the end of the night, we're going to read this poem, which is called The Wreck of the Deutschland. It's a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins. It's my favorite poem. Not that I'm biased. Gerard Manley Hopkins is a great Catholic poet. As a real Catholic, kind of sacramental worldview or ethos. So anyway, we'll look at that poem, and by then we'll be, I'm sure, quite sick of philosophy, so that'll be a nice break. And we'll be able to take kind of what we've looked at from these different aesthetic theories and apply them a little bit to Hopkins. Okay. All right, so without further ado, let's begin by looking at this first handout called From Wit and Mystery. Okay. This is going to tell us a little bit about St. Thomas's aesthetics, his theory of poetry. So if we just want to kind of go around point by point, if we could start over here. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Casey.
Casey. If you'd like to start with point number 1 on that first handout. Thanks.
Metaphor, which seems to be a device distinctive of poetry and foreign to the physical and mathematical sciences and to metaphysics and logic, turns up again and again in Christian theology. The fact would not have concerned Thomas had he been thinking of theology as some sort of whimsical expression on religious themes, as random, if impressive talk. But he was concerned with a theology maintained as a strict science, and the question his discussion broaches is whether theology, if it is a strict science, can be justified in its employment of metaphor. He finds that it can.
Right. Okay, so before we go on, does everyone understand kind of what's at issue there? Or what the reason is that St. Thomas is concerned about this? So he approaches theology as a science, right? And we understand, I'm sure we're all familiar with the phrase, theology is faith-seeking understanding. So theology begins with faith, but then it's reason trying to go as far as reason can go in understanding divine mysteries. So St. Thomas is certainly convinced that theology is a science, that is a rational and systematic means of investigating, reality. But the problem here is that theology relies so much on metaphor, and you'll find that in a lot of theological discourse is that metaphor is kind of a fundamental, tool of theology, and it's also, he says, a device distinctive of poetry, seems to be foreign to the sciences. So we wouldn't ordinarily think of metaphor in connection with science. So St. Thomas is raising the question here, just whether we can use metaphor in theology. And then, so point 2, this is a quote from St. Thomas, if you want to go ahead with that. Science.
The science of poetry is about things which, because of their deficiency of truth, cannot be laid hold of by the reason. Hence the reason has to draw off to the side by means of certain comparisons. But then, theology is about things which lie beyond reason. Thus, the symbolic method is common to both sciences, since neither is itself accommodated to the human reason.
Okay. Let's move on to the next point. That'll kind of explain what St. Thomas just said. Point number 3.
For Thomas, Christian theology and poetry are indeed not the same thing, but lie at opposite poles of human knowledge. However, the very fact that they are opposite extremes gives them something of a common relation to that which lies between them. They both operate on the periphery of human intellection. A poem dips below the range of the human process of understanding by reason, as the subject of theology sweeps above it.
Yeah, that's very good. So that kind of gives us a broad outline of St. Thomas's, maybe sort of the spectrum of what he's thinking of here, just tracing the contours of what we're talking about. So both theology and poetry use metaphor, and both theology and poetry, Thomas is going to assert, to defend the fact that they're both sciences, they're both rational sciences, but he points out here, theology is about things which lie beyond reason. Poetry, the science of poetry, deals with things which, quote, because of their deficiency of truth, cannot be laid hold of by the reason. So the human reason is operating if it's operating here, theology is soaring up here, dealing with sublime truths, and poetry actually dips somewhere down here, below what reason can directly investigate, the rational method can investigate. But that's not to say that theology and poetry don't fall within the realm of reason, but the methods of reason, of rational inquiry, can't address them directly. And so that's why we have recourse to metaphor. Point 4, he says, the deficiency of truth in a poem is to be traced to the peculiar kind of existence which a poem exercises, to its inability to survive the abstraction, which is the peculiar condition of human understanding. So that's the way that reason operates, right, is by abstraction. So we can move on to point number 5. That'll give us some information about abstraction.
Although truth is founded on the real, is in touch with the real, we can get into intellectual contact with reality only by the peculiar operation known as abstraction. Abstraction, for all the weaknesses and inadequacy of the process itself, is necessary both because of the kind of being man is, and conversely, because of the kind of being with which he is in immediate contact, being which includes in itself matter. The fact is that an individual existent of the sort we encounter, an individual whose being is grounded in matter, cannot in terms of its own being alone make an understanding of itself available to the one looking at or feeling it. This is simply a matter of observation. For understanding, which comes with science, we need to examine a multiplicity of individuals, or at least of individual instances. Only when we have experience of a number of other things and manage to put together various charts and tables and laws or principles, all of them abstractions, can we hope to possess intellectually, to understand, intelligere, the very existence of about us here and now.
So that's just a little background on how St. Thomas explains the process of reason. So with reason, the normal rational process, we observe all these different individual things, and we form abstractions. So we go from the particular things we sense and experience to form general concepts. That's kind of the process of how reason works. But poetry, he's saying, the reason that poetry is kind of resistant to reason is because it's resistant to abstraction, right? I had a literature teacher once who would say that poetry resists adequate paraphrase. So you can't paraphrase a poem. I mean, in a sense, you can. I could tell you this poem we're going to read tonight is about a shipwreck where 5 Franciscan nuns drowned off the coast of England. But that's not really paraphrasing the poem. You're talking about it, but by trying to paraphrase it, you destroy the poem. It doesn't survive the paraphrasing or the abstraction. Whereas if you observe all these chairs, and you have a mental image, a general concept of what a chair is from all the chairs you've seen, a chair survives abstraction. A chair is not resistant to abstraction, but a poem is. So we'll just read point 6 here, and then I think we'll move on to the next handout. If you'd like to go ahead with point 6.
It is a matter of record that this is the kind of understanding of things men have. Regarding the chances for a science of poetry in a setting such as this, St. Thomas, never too sanguine about human intellectual prowess, is clearly aware that there are going to be difficulties. He is aware of the unsatisfactory and inconclusive, not to say distressing, nature of discussion about any poem. Because of its peculiar insistence on remaining concreted within the act of apprehension itself, a poem resists the very abstraction by which we would understand it. Abstraction, in one way or another, destroys it, dissolves it away. So we must content ourselves largely with simply apprehending the poem by reading or hearing it read, and as for any strict understanding of a poem, we must content ourselves with thinking and talking around it. Thomas does not put it in exactly the same words, but when he speaks of its deficiency of truth, he is concerned with the same thing about a poem which prompts Archibald MacLeish to observe that a poem should not mean, but be.
So one thing to note there is this phrase deficiency of truth. St. Thomas isn't, you might say, attacking poetry or trying to discredit poetry. We'll see in the next handout from this Dominican father, Paul Murray, that St. Thomas believes poetry is firmly within the realm of reason, so it does convey meaning. When he says the deficiency of truth, the way that I read it is he's referring to the kind of truth that can be gained by reason. That's not the kind of truth or the mode of truth that poetry presents to us, right? So this author, this Jesuit, is spot on when he says we have to, in a way, content ourselves with just apprehending the poem by reading it or hearing it read, and to try to analyze it, we can talk around it. We can kind of come at it sideways, but we can't understand it directly, like we can understand the chair or something else, in reality. So just to kind of get the contours of St. Thomas's thought about poetry. And a few brief quotes just from the rest of the handout. We don't have time to go into it in depth. In point number 7, he says, like I just mentioned, we're approaching it by a kind of indirection, and that's metaphor. Metaphor is kind of the coming at it sideways, coming at the poetry from another angle, other than directly by reason. And in point number 8, this author describes for us that reason is an imperfect way of getting at a thing. So I think it's perhaps a common understanding of the modern mindset that reason is kind of the only way to get at the truth, right? That's kind of the philosophical error at the heart of scientism, which is telling us the only way to get at the truth is by the scientific method. Well, that's patently false. There's far greater truths that exist that we can access, but not by the scientific method. So in point 8, he's just saying reason is an imperfect way of getting at the truth, a special approach which produces understanding only under certain conditions, and those things which are not amenable to these conditions simply escape it. Okay, so this is just providing kind of a sympathetic reading of St. Thomas on poetry. And then to move on to the next handout, Aquinas on poetry and theology. Sorry, a question in the back?
I did have one question about something earlier. You talked about how theology goes above the human understanding and poetry goes beneath the human understanding. And what do you exactly mean by going beneath? I don't understand the metaphor.
Yeah. The way that I read it is kind of this. Theology, because theology deals with sublime truths which are far beyond human understanding. God is far beyond reason. And so theology, in a sense, like I mentioned earlier, in theology, faith-seeking understanding, reason tries to go as far as it can, but eventually reason kind of hits the ceiling, And so the proper object of theology is above reason. And poetry, I think what he means by going below reason is that I don't know. It's sort of hard to, you know, maybe it's poetic speech. It's kind of hard to pin down.
Yeah.
I think he's pointing to something, you know, we might say something deeper or more profound in the human experience than what reason can get at directly than our everyday experience.
So
That's kind of how I read it.
So is it like sub-rational appeal or something?
Well, I'm not sure. In a literal way, yes. Yeah, it would be sub-rational, beneath reason. Maybe not in the kind of pejorative sense. but like,
Animalistic, primitive,
yeah.
emotional base.
Could
Yeah.
one say, could one also say that theology basically aspires the intellect toward that which is toward God,
Mm.
so to speak? Whereas poetry doesn't necessarily have to do that, and therefore, you know, it uses a similar method,
Hmm.
but it is at a different level, you know, a much
could be.
lower level, if you will.
That could be, yeah. Well, these are all good points for me to consider as I write my capstone project. You're all helping me with that tonight. What we're going to see here, I want to point to footnote 12 on this Aquinas on Poetry and Theology handout. This is very important. This author, this Dominican, tells us, footnote 12 at the bottom, occasional comments that Thomas makes about art and poetry might seem to suggest that his view corresponds with modern and contemporary opinions on the autonomy of art. He writes, for example, the value of things produced by art does not consist in their being good for human appetite, but in the good of the works of art themselves. But to read this statement and conclude that Thomas is an advocate of art for art's sake would, of course, be a huge misunderstanding. The entire system of Aquinas is based upon finality, or telos, right? And so what we see in many modern philosophers, even some modern theologians, I think von Balthasar kind of trends in this direction, although I don't know if he says it explicitly. But we kind of see poetry and theology collapsing into one, you know. And so where Thomas says there's similarities, but the similarity is in how far they are from each other, and in how far they are from reason, right? But many of these modern theologians and philosophers, the existentialists do this too, by the way, collapse them kind of into one science. So there's no distinction between poetry and theology. But St. Thomas preserved that distinction. So that's very good. Thank you for reminding me of that. Good. Okay, any other questions? Sean?
Could that last comment you just made, that modern movement, could that explain why, for example, the study of metaphysics is being collapsed into
Oh, absolutely. I think
how
so,
it's
yeah.
become, superstition has been collapsed into the science of being
Yes.
and sort of melded together, whereas one used to be a legitimate philosophical science and
Right.
the other one is literally just superstition.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Because a lot of modern philosophy lacks the idea of philosophy as a science, or rather, the idea of philosophy as a science is so reduced to a narrow field of analytic philosophy, right? That everything else is considered, oh, it's just literature.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So if we could go on to point 1 of this handout, Aquinas on Poetry and Theology.
That last suggestion is immediately striking, but it represents, at best, I would say, only a part of the truth. It does not represent Aquinas' entire thinking on the question of meaning in a work of art. Nowadays, in certain schools of literary criticism, it's common for a stark distinction to be made between the truth of logic and the truth of poetry, as if the latter were entirely outside the realm of logical discourse and reasoning. But Thomas, in his commentary on the posterior analytics of Aristotle, speaks of what he calls poetic logic. It's true he thinks of it as occupying a place below that of the logic of scientific demonstration, and below even that of dialectic and rhetoric. Nevertheless, the art of poetry, he maintains, is still somehow within the domain of reason and logic.
Go ahead.
Meaning, therefore, for Aquinas is certainly not absent from the special discourse which constitutes a poem. He writes, "Poems partake of reason, by which man is man, to a greater degree than other mechanical works." These statements of Aquinas clearly imply a much more positive view of reason in its relation to art than the view which has been dominant since the Romantic period. During that time, the majority of artists and poets reacted with understandable but at times exaggerated passion against rationalism. St. Thomas, in contrast, writing prior to the development of these somewhat extreme modern dichotomies, does not hesitate in his work to speak of right reason in relation to the thinking of works of art. That confidence in reason, that Thomistic confidence, inspired Flannery O'Connor to make the following memorable remark.
Go ahead, Justin.
When I write, I am a maker. I think about what I am making. St. Thomas called art reason in the making. When I write, I feel I am engaged in the reasonable use of the unreasonable. In art, the reason goes wherever the imagination goes. We have reduced the use of reason terribly. You say a thing is reasonable, and people think you mean it's safe. What's reasonable is seldom safe and always exciting.
That's a nice little quote there. Yeah, so we have a good idea now, at least a kind of a general idea, of the contours of what St. Thomas thinks about poetry. So poetry, one note that I made here as I was reading this, and I'll just put this on the floor. I'm not saying it's necessarily the way to read this, but it's kind of how I read it, is that for St. Thomas, the process of art or of writing poetry is reasonable, in that it's within the domain of reason. It's a rational process. But the product maybe dips below the range of reason. So it seems like in the back here, footnote at the end of footnote 12, there's this quote from In Primum Librum Pastoriorum Analyticorum, right, on the topic of art. So Thomas says, art seems to be nothing more than a particular procedure established by reason, whereby human acts in prescribed ways attain their appropriate end. So he sees the procedure as established by reason, within the domain of reason, the process of making a poem or something like that. But the product, or its effect, maybe dips below reason. Just put that out there. Does anyone have any other thoughts to share about this?
So, like the art of chair making wouldn't be an example of the kind of thing he's talking about.
Well, perhaps. I think, yeah, you're right. I think when he's talking about art here, it is in a broad sense like that. I mean, it's a very broad description, right? Whereby human acts in prescribed ways attain their appropriate end. But I don't think he would say that chair making dips below human reason. I think that might be unique to poetry. Yeah.
So, the dipping below human reason, it seems to me that he doesn't think much of poetry, so I'm not quite sure I'm understanding unless that's true, that he doesn't think much of poetry.
Well, I think he does think quite highly of poetry.
So I'm not quite getting, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, the dipping below.
Father Eric, do you have an answer for that question or a different question?
Well, as you're talking, I'm thinking, but he himself
exactly.
wrote poetry.
He was a magnificent poet.
Yeah. But what I'm thinking is that perhaps it's that difference between the affect and the intellect, where the affect is seen as being lower.
Like the product of the art?
Well, no, the inspiration for the art would be the affect, for instance. So the affections or the feelings, the emotions.
Whereas the intellect would be kind of the impetus for theology.
Yeah.
Would you say?
Yeah, I think the quote by Flannery O'Connor is very helpful.
Yeah.
In
what way?
The writers will be bought from the ability to make a particular thing which can only be unpacked, but which can't be analyzed. So what you're doing is you're creating something. Think of a good painting. Think of music that holds together, or a painting that holds together a poem that you wouldn't want to really take apart, but which is in fact is a new experience. Which isn't simply canvassing or covering some other kind of observation or some kind of social good or whatever, what have you, that actually has its own weight. I think that's
very good.
So the above below is not a value judgment.
Exactly.
You could have said left or right.
That's right.
Right.
Okay.
And the use of above and below, it tends to communicate that kind of
Because it sounds like it's a
that's a good point.
The powers
Thank
of the
you.
soul are four, and then you can take them and say, well, intellect and will are the higher ones, and irascible, confusable are the lower ones, but they're all four part of the powers of the soul, so they're all good. So it's lower in a different sense.
The
It's
above and
not,
below things
it's not
that
lesser.
Not less
It's-
good.
You talk about this with hierarchy.
Okay.
Yeah, the hierarchy
yes.
really is. It's not evaluation. It's not a means of evaluating one thing against another, but it is a fact of order.
Yeah.
But I think the Flannery O'Connor quotes.
You're right. I love what she says, the reasonable use of the unreasonable. That points to what you're saying as well. And I think also there's a dimension of mystery in there somewhere too. I think St. Thomas might agree that arts can sometimes communicate mystery in a way that touches the human spirit differently than, you know, a work of theology, perhaps, or than a work of the intellect. You know, so they both have their proper roles, and we can see that, as Father Eric pointed out, exemplified in his own life as a brilliant theologian and a brilliant Latin poet, you know, and writer of hymns. So, very good. Now, from the existentialist aesthetics, we're not going to read through it bit by bit. That would just ruin our nights. So I'm just going to bring out a couple of things from this handout, just to give an idea of the existentialist philosophy. Right. So we see at the beginning here. So existentialism, right, owes its name to its emphasis on existence. So the existentialists, to paint with a broad brush, might say that whereas St. Thomas would like us to acknowledge that essence precedes existence, the existentialists would prefer us to say that existence precedes essence. So what does that mean? So the fact that we exist and the manner in which we exist as human beings in the world is different from how anything else exists. The existentialists would say that we, as human beings, we have radical freedom to choose how we use our being, because we know that we exist, and we know in a certain sense like what it means to exist in the world. So we can choose to exist in particular ways, which an animal or other forms of being don't have that choice. So by that radical freedom that we have, in a sense, we're the, you know, the masters of reality. Meaning, for the existentialists, meaning in the world depends on human beings. So and this is kind of there's a range of opinions about this. Not all existentialists believe the same thing, but in general, we might say for the existentialists, well, I believe there's a quote in here at the end of point number 2. For the existentialists, the world is no longer hospitable to our human desire for meaning and order. So the human heart has that natural longing implanted in it by God for reason, for order, right order. But for the existentialists, they would say, well, as it says here, most of them followed Nietzsche in the conviction that God is dead. So art's power of revelation is to a large extent devoted to expressing the absurdity of the human condition. So where we long for meaning, for truth, they would say there's no such thing. There's only meaning or truth insofar as we create it. So we just have brute being out there, lots of things that exist, and we order them all into a system that we like, and we can alter that as we like. It's one consequence of the existentialist philosophy. But there's something here that I think that we can salvage, something at least we should acknowledge, where they, in point number 2, it says, freedom grants the human being the capacity of revealing essential features of the world and of the beings in it. And since artistic practice is one of the prime examples of free human activity, it is therefore also one of the privileged modes of revealing what the world is about. So that's perhaps a concept that we can take away from existentialist aesthetics. This idea that by artistic creation, the role of the artist, in a sense, is to bring out some meaning from reality, which is existent, is already present, right, in reality. He's not creating it, but he's bringing something out. He's causing something to be revealed, which is there in creation. And point number 3 just tells us, existentialists view art in terms of revelation, that concept of revealing something. So they favor representative arts, and they're suspicious of formalist avant-gardes. So contemporary kind of with the rise of existentialism is the rise of formalism, which you might know from, I guess maybe Jackson Pollock would be an example of a modern formalist, where there's really no content. You know, he's not representing anything with his art. It's purely the form of the art that is the art. It is also a good example of art for art's sake. So it's not intended to do anything per se. It's just empty creation. You know, the existentialists in general would have opposed that because they have this idea of art in terms of revelation, or actually revealing something. And St. Thomas would be, I think, on board with that, where he points out earlier, art is teleological. Art has a purpose, not art for art's sake. So the purpose of art is to reveal something. Now we need to talk about phenomenology. a little bit. Right. So there's this concept which comes from a school of philosophy called phenomenology. The concept is called intentionality, and that has had a big effect on existentialism. So intentionality, this is point number 5 on the back of the first page of this handout. Point number 5. What does intentionality mean? And why is it such a central notion in existentialist thinking about art? Well, Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, shows that when any type of meaning is articulated, a specific act of consciousness occurs. The specificity of the meaning in question depends on the particular way in which consciousness intends its content in each case. That is, the specific way in which it relates to a given. Okay, so the point that Edmund Husserl is making here is that when consciousness determines or draws out some meaning from what's presented to it, that's what he means by a given. So something in creation, for example, a chair. So my consciousness is intending this chair, and he's just pointing out that consciousness can intend things or, try to grasp things in reality in different ways or in different modes. So he points out, you can relate to a given as an object to know, to judge, perceive, enjoy, and so on. So one example of this, which I was thinking about earlier as I read this, maybe some of you have seen on YouTube, there are videos of these modern art museums where people will be, I think there's a couple like this, people will be walking through, and there'll be this guy, like a maintenance guy, he's on the ladder, he's changing a light, and all the people will be walking through the museum, looking at all the exhibits, and they'll stop and they'll just gather around, and they'll be observing this guy on the ladder, changing the light, he's just doing his job, but they're all intending him, if we want to use Husserl's terminology, as if like this were some art exhibition, some new installation. So they're all, commenting on it, they're observing, and then the guy comes down and takes his ladder away, and they're all embarrassed, and they move on. Right, so that shows they were in this particular mode of intending, where they're thinking about, they're observing all this art, and they're thinking of everything that they're seeing in terms of art, and so they don't necessarily make that shift. In a modern art museum, anything goes, right? So it might be anything that they'd see in there and would be a work of art. So they intend this guy on the ladder as if he were some object of art. Whereas, if they were in their office, maybe, and they saw a guy on a ladder changing the lights, they would intend him in more of an everyday mode. Right? Is anybody feeling lost or confused? Sean?
So I'm going to take a quick stab at phenomenology here, because what I see is it's sort of an arbitrary, although I'm not entirely opposed to it, but it's an arbitrary determination elevating the consciousness, which then ultimately leads to subjectivism. And you do get this, for example, you mentioned earlier with the formalism.
Yeah.
And in that, you find, for example, that it's almost impossible today to ask an artist, what did you intend by your work? Because that's almost seen as a form of insult, to ask them to apply meaning. And so you have this dichotomy brewing where you do have the general population lives in a phenomenological world. We all apply our own meaning to everything we observe, with no regard to any sort of objective truth. And yet, when you ask when you ask an artist in particular, that's something like that, it becomes a point of contention because it's not about the meaning, it's not about the content, it's about the process.
You're right. There is a danger, which is kind of latent within phenomenology. But I don't think phenomenology itself is to blame.
Okay.
And so the reason for that is that phenomenology, when Husserl, this guy Edmund Husserl kind of founded phenomenology, his aim was to found a science of philosophy. So return philosophy to the rigors of science in a way that would be accepted by the modern world. And, arguably, he may have attained that or not. John Paul II certainly had high regard for phenomenology, and it played a very important role in his personal study of philosophy. Because primarily what phenomenology is doing It involves what's called the phenomenological reduction, and so it's to look at what we're experiencing in consciousness, and to, in a sense, try and take a step back and say, okay, what is consciousness doing when I intend this work of art versus when I intend this chair, or when I intend, somebody who I love versus somebody on the street. Just looking at different operations of consciousness is what it's doing. Now there is that potential kind of
Real
for the.
quick, you're using the word intend over and over again, and I'm not sure if you mean the same thing every time.
I may or may not. I think I have every time I meant.
Okay. So
is there a time that was confusing?
Yeah, when you say when I intend a chair.
Yeah.
That's like seeing, right?
Well, not really, but I can see how you think that because I keep doing this. But it's not really seeing with the eyes, but it's there's this concept of the intentionality of consciousness, whereas consciousness is always a thing that is conscious of something. So you never just have consciousness floating in a void. If you're conscious, if you have consciousness, it's consciousness of something. That's the intentionality.
So you're knowing something?
And it's not really knowing either, it's just consciousness. Yeah.
Apprehending?
Perhaps we could say apprehending. Yeah.
An example, I think, would be like a hunter or gatherer had never seen a chair, and he sees a chair, and
Right.
it's firewood.
Yeah, exactly.
He intends it to be it's firewood. For him, it is firewood.
Oh, that's very good. Yeah, so he would be intending the chair in that kind of utilitarian sense. Whereas for someone who has an abstract concept of a chair, right, they've experienced lots of chairs and formed this general idea, they know what a chair is, they'd intend it as something to sit on. Or perhaps as a work of art, if they're a modern artist. Okay, I should stop picking on modern artists. Very good. Let's. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. I missed that.
Oh, they deserve it. Modern artists deserve it.
Let's just move on. For the sake of getting to Heidegger, that basically, I think, gives us a good idea of existentialist aesthetics. Oh, but one more thing from point 6 that would just be important to know. Yes. Okay, so this is to Sean's point that he just brought up a moment ago. So phenomenology, it says about halfway down point 6. The emphasis on intentionality avoids these dualisms, that is, certain dualisms of classical philosophy, subject versus object, and so on, because it entails, on the one hand, yes, that all meanings are constituted through acts of human consciousness, thus insisting on the active role of the subject in the formulation of any meaningful aspect of the world. But on the other hand, the theory of intentionality also implies that the world already contains the meanings that consciousness reveals, either because these meanings are potentialities, from the point of view of human action, which is Jean-Paul Sartre's view, or simply because these meanings are already in the world, which is the view of Merleau-Ponty and Gabriel Marcel, and I believe of Heidegger as well. So you see, phenomenology can accommodate either a subjectivist kind of reading where all meaning is purely constructed by consciousness, or it can accommodate a more classical reading, which is, I believe, reconcilable with Thomistic philosophy, which is that the meanings are already there, but depending on how consciousness intends the given, that determines the meaning that we draw out, or that is revealed. So that's something to keep in mind as we go to read now Heidegger. Just one more point, from the end of Existentialist Aesthetics. Point number 9. Every attempt to disclose a portion of the world tends to aim for the disclosure of the totality of beings. Many existentialist writers have stressed this primordial, metaphysical function of the work of art as a partial revealing that aims to uncover the totality of being. That's something just to know, because that'll come up as we read this essay by Heidegger. Okay, any other questions that are pressing before we start? Okay. All right, so we'll begin with Poetically Man Dwells. And I think we left off with you, Sean, if you'd like to start with the first paragraph.
The phrase is taken from a late poem by Hölderlin, which comes to us by a curious route. It begins, "In lovely blueness blooms the steeple with metal roof, Stuttgart, edition 2, etc. If we are to hear the phrase poetically man dwells rightly, we must restore it thoughtfully to the poem. For that reason, let us give thought to the phrase. Let us clear up the doubts it immediately arouses. For otherwise, we should lack the free readiness to respond to the phrase by following.
Poetically man dwells. If need be, we can imagine that poets do on occasion dwell poetically. But how is man, and this means every man and all the time, supposed to dwell poetically? Does not all dwelling remain incompatible with the poetic? Our dwelling is harnessed, no, it's harassed, by the housing shortage. Even if that were not so, our dwelling today is harassed by work, made insecure by the hunt for gain and success, bewitched by the entertainment and recreation. But when there is still room left in today's dwelling for the poetic, and time is still set aside, what comes to pass is at best a preoccupation with aestheticizing, whether in writing or on the air. Poetry is either rejected as a frivolous moving and vaporizing into the unknown, and a flight into dreamland, or is counted as a part of literature, and the validity of literature is assessed by the latest prevailing standard. The prevailing standard, in turn, is made and controlled by the organs for making public civilized opinions. One of its functionaries, at once driver and leader, is the literature industry. In such a setting, poetry cannot appear otherwise than as literature. Where it is studied entirely in educational and scientific terms, it is the object of literary history. Western poetry goes under the general heading of European literature.
But if the sole form in which poetry exists is literary to start with, then how can human dwelling be understood as based on the poetic? The phrase, man dwells poetically, comes indeed from a mere poet, and in fact from one who, we are told, could not cope with life. It is the way of poets to shut their eyes to actuality. Instead of acting, they dream. What they make is merely imagined. The things of imagination are merely made. Making is, in Greek, a Greek word.
Poesis.
Poesis. And man's dwelling is supposed to be poetry and poetic. This can be assumed surely only by someone who stands aside from actuality and does not want to see the existent condition of man's historical social life today. The sociologists call it the collective. That last sentence was confusing.
Okay, yeah, so we can pause for a minute. So he's just laying out some anticipated objections to the opening phrase of the essay, Poetically Man Dwells, which comes from this poem by the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin. So he's pointing out, it doesn't seem maybe that man dwells poetically. Do we dwell at all? Maybe poets dwell poetically, but how can we say that man in general dwells poetically? He's pointing out also, this last sentence, this can be assumed. So he's pointing out kind of the poets, the general perception of poets is that they somehow stand apart from reality. They're kind of divorced from real life. So we could say, well, maybe poets sometimes dwell poetically, but how can we say that everybody does? Okay, just pointing out some objections. And if we can move on to the next paragraph.
But before we so bluntly pronounce dwelling and poetry incompatible, it may be well to attend soberly to the poet's statement. It speaks of man dwelling, or man's dwelling. It does not describe today's dwelling conditions. Above all, it does not assert that to dwell means to occupy a house, a dwelling place, nor does it say that the poetic exhausts itself in an unreal play of poetic imagination. What thoughtful men, therefore, would presume to declare unhesitantly and from a somewhat dubious elevation that dwelling and the poetic are incompatible. Perhaps the two can beat with each other.
And bear.
this is not all. Perhaps one even bears the other in such a way that dwelling rests on the poetic. If this is indeed what we suppose, then we are required to think of dwelling and poetry in terms of their essential nature. If we do not balk at this demand, we think of what is usually called the existence of man in terms of dwelling. In doing so, we do, of course, give up the customary notion of dwelling. According to that idea, dwelling remains merely one form of human behavior alongside many others. We work in the city but dwell outside of it. We travel and we dwell, now here, now there. Dwelling, so understood, is always merely the occupancy of a lodging.
So Heidegger is telling us here we're talking about poetry and dwelling in terms of what they are essentially. So we're going to have to move beyond our normal maybe definitions of those terms and other terms we'll find as we read this essay. He's going to use some common words in very particular ways. So we'll keep an eye out for that. He just expresses here, I'll just read the next paragraph briefly, that when Hölderlin speaks of dwelling, he has before his eyes the basic character of human existence. He sees the poetic, moreover, by way of its relation to this dwelling, thus understood essentially. So this concept of dwelling, he says, is the basic character of human existence. So that means this idea of dwelling, that's the most fundamental thing for human being in the world, this idea of dwelling. Okay, so we'll come back to that, but it'll be good to keep in mind that dwelling for Hölderlin, and so for Heidegger, is kind of fundamental. Okay. This does not mean, though, that the poetic is merely an ornament and bonus added to dwelling, nor does the poetic character of dwelling mean merely that the poetic turns up in some way or other in all dwelling. Rather, the phrase "poetically man dwells" says, poetry first causes dwelling to be dwelling. Poetry is what really lets us dwell. So if dwelling is the fundamental characteristic, the basic character of human existence, and poetry is what lets us dwell, then we can imagine that poetry is going to be pretty important for human existence as we go through this essay. But through what do we attain to a dwelling place? Through building. Okay, and that's just, we can understand that in a totally ordinary way, you know. So how do we attain to a place to live? Well, somebody has to build it first. Okay. Poetic creation, which lets us dwell, is a kind of building. So if we can kind of follow the logic here, and this is something you have to do in reading Heidegger, just follow his train of thought, which is sometimes difficult. But okay, in this at least is pretty straightforward. So dwelling is the fundamental characteristic of human being in the world. Poetry lets us dwell. Building is required for any dwelling place. So if poetry is what lets us dwell, then poetry is going to be a kind of building. Okay. So we're going to come back to that.
So,
yeah.
I'm trying to contrast that with well, all beings have a dwelling place. Right? Then, when you say, well, where does God dwell? It's certainly not a physical place. It's everywhere. I'm trying to distinguish between, a more general way of thinking of dwelling, and I'm thinking of more, kind of keep myself within this limited definition of it. I'm not sure I have it, but speaking out loud, just maybe try to.
That's good.
Drill that some more.
He's going to give us some more information about what he means by dwelling pretty soon. So we can just put that on the back burner for a moment. And if we can go on with, thus we confront a double demand.
Thus we confront a double demand. For one thing, we are to think of what is called man's existence by way of the nature of dwelling. For another, we are to think of the nature of poetry as a letting dwell, as a, perhaps even the, distinctive kind of building. If we search out the nature of poetry according to this viewpoint, then we arrive at the nature of dwelling.
Okay. Right, so the nature of poetry as a letting dwell. Okay. So just to keep that in mind. Well, let's skip the next paragraph because it kind of goes into an aside. This is something Heidegger does a lot also, is he just forgets what he's talking about and talks about something else for a while. So here he's making a point about language which is arguable. Okay, so down to where he says poetically man dwells in the center of the page. Please.
Poetically man dwells, says the poet. We hear Oberlin's words more clearly when we take them back into the poem in which they belong. First, let us listen only to the two lines from which we have detached and thus clipped the phrase. They run, full of merit, yet poetically man dwells on this earth. The keynote of the lines vibrates in the word poetically. This word is set off in two directions, by what comes before it and by what follows.
So before it are the words full of merit, yet. So he points out they sound almost as if the next word, poetically, full of merit, yet poetically, introduced a restriction on the profitable meritorious dwelling of man. But it is just the reverse, Heidegger says. The restriction is denoted by the expression full of merit, to which we must add in thought, to be sure. Full of merit, to be sure, yet poetically, man dwells on this earth. So man, to be sure, merits and earns much in his dwelling, for he cultivates the growing things of the earth and takes care of his increase. Cultivating and caring, colere, cultura, are a kind of building. But man not only cultivates what produces growth out of itself, he also builds in the sense of edificare, by erecting things that cannot come into being and subsist by growing. Things that are built in this sense include not only buildings, but all the works made by man's hands and through his arrangements. Merits due to this building, however, can never fill out the nature of dwelling. On the contrary, they even deny dwelling its own nature when they are pursued and acquired purely for their own sake. For in that case, these merits, or we could also say the benefits, precisely by their abundance, would everywhere constrain dwelling within the bounds of this kind of building. Does anyone have any problems with that so far, or any questions about what he's talking about here?
The only thing I would point out is that building in English can be a noun or it can be the gerund form of a verb. And I think he's referring to the verb.
He is. Yeah, he is. So yeah, he's talking about different understandings of the activity of building. So cultivating or caring for the earth, crops, and then actually creating buildings. Or also, he says all the works made by man's hands, we can understand. Cities, systems, So these are all these different ways that man builds, and he connects that to this line in Holderlin's poem where he says, full of merits. Okay, these are all man's merits, right? All these things that man has built with his hands. Yet, poetically, man dwells on this earth. So full of merit, to be sure, but yet poetically. Man builds all these things, but yet there's something else. Yeah.
So, I don't want to extrapolate the point too much here, but there seems to be an analogy or metaphor being made to the rules of poetry and poems and the rules of the building process. And if I were to sort of anticipate Heidegger's philosophy of architecture, I would say he would say that there's a telos there too.
Yes.
That you can't just have these plain, we see them nowadays, there's no art form to them at all.
Yeah,
and that's almost an abuse of man dwelling poetically. You almost have to dehumanize the person in order to create some of the structures that lack any sort of form.
Yeah.
They're literally formless.
That's very true. Heidegger would be very sympathetic to that, I think.
Yeah.
For being a modern philosopher, he was famously anti-modern in many ways. I mean, in the sense that he pointed out the ways that, as he says here, these merits, precisely by their abundance, would everywhere constrain dwelling within the bounds of this kind of building. He points out how all the structures of modern society, the technological advancements and things like that, constrain the dwelling of man, constrain human existence in an unnatural way. So he would certainly be sympathetic to that. Yeah.
It almost sounds like he's saying that. It almost sounds like that he's saying that poetry is sort of an essential activity of man. That, and I wonder if he's saying that could you be human without being poetic, or is being poetic somehow connected to the creativity of being in the image and likeness of God?
We'll get there. Yeah, I hope we'll get there. Okay. Okay, great. So just to finish out this paragraph, and then we'll move on a bit. He says, and we're about a third of the way from the bottom. Building in the sense of the farmer's cultivation of growing things and of the erecting of edifices and works and the production of tools is already a consequence of the nature of dwelling. But it is not its ground, let alone its grounding. This grounding must take place in a different building. He means again the act of building. Building of the usual kind, often practiced exclusively, and therefore the only one that is familiar, does of course bring an abundance of merits into dwelling. Yet man is capable of dwelling only if he has already built, is building, and remains disposed to build in another way, namely a poetic way. Okay. So if we can continue with the next paragraph.
Full of merit, to be sure, yet poetically man dwells. This is followed in the text by the words, on this earth. We might be inclined to think the addition superfluous, for dwelling, after all, already means man's stay on earth. On this earth, to which every mortal knows himself to be entrusted and exposed.
But when Hölderlin ventures to say that the dwelling of mortals is poetic, this statement, as soon as it is made, gives the impression that on the contrary, poetic dwelling snatches man away from the earth. For the poetic, when it is taken as poetry, is supposed to belong to the realm of fantasy. Poetic dwelling flies fantastically above reality. The poet counters this misgiving by saying expressly that poetic dwelling is a dwelling on this earth. Hölderlin thus not only protects the poetic from a likely misinterpretation, but by adding the words on this earth expressly points to the nature of poetry. Poetry does not fly above and surmount the earth in order to escape it and hover over it. Poetry is what first brings man onto the earth, making him belong to it, and thus brings him into dwelling.
Okay.
Full of merit, yet poetically, man dwells on this earth.
Do we know now why man dwells poetically? We still do not. I love that. We now even run the risk of intruding foreign thoughts into Hölderlin's poetic words. For Hölderlin indeed speaks of man's dwelling and his merit, but still he does not connect dwelling with building, as we have just done. Okay. Well, that's fine. Heidegger goes off into another tangent for a while. So let us go to the paragraph that begins, but what does Hölderlin say of the poetic dwelling of man? Can you see that? Okay. And if we can continue with that one.
Sorry, I'm not finding that. But what does Hölderlin say of poetic dwelling of man? We seek the answer to the question by listening to lines 24 and 38 of our poem. For the two lines on which we first commented are spoken from their region. Hölderlin says, "May, if life is sheer toil, a man lift his eyes and say, so, I too wish to be. Yes, as long as kindness, the pure, still stays with his heart, man not unhappily measures himself against the Godhead. Is God unknown? Is he manifest like the sky? I'd sooner believe the latter. It's the measure of the man. Full of merit, yet poetically, man dwells on this earth. But no purer is the shade of the starry night, if I might put it so, than man who's called an image of the Godhead. Is there a measure on earth? There is none.
Okay. Please.
We shall think
over only a few points in these lines, and for the sole purpose of hearing more clearly what Holderlin means when he calls man's dwelling a poetic one. The first lines, 24 to 26, give us a clue. They are in the form of a question that is answered confidently in the affirmative. The question is a paraphrase of what lines already expounded so directly, full of merit, yet poetically, man dwells on the earth. Holderlin asks, may, if life is sheer toil, a man lift his eyes and say, so I too wish to be. Yes.
Okay. Or on the couch back there.
Only in the realm of sheer toil does man toil for merits. There he obtains them for himself in abundance. But at the same time, in this realm, man is allowed to look up, out of it, through it, toward the divinities. The upward glance passes aloft toward the sky, and yet remains below on the earth. The upward glance spans the between of the sky and earth. This between is measured out for dwelling of man. We now call the span, thus meted out, the dimension. The dimension does not arise from the fact that sky and earth are turned toward one another. Rather, their facing each other itself depends on the dimension. Nor is the dimension a stretch of the space as ordinarily understood, for everything spatial as something for which space is made. Reality is in need of dimension, that is, that into which it is admitted.
Okay, that is a very typically confusing Heideggerian paragraph. But this is really important, so we should dwell on it for a minute. Dwell on it. Yes. Yeah. Okay, so when he talks about this upward glance, okay, so in the poem, may if life is sheer toil, a man lift his eyes and say, so I too wish to be. Yes. Okay. So he's talking about in the everyday experience, a man lifting his eyes to heaven and saying, I wish to be so. I wish to be like that. You know, in that upward glance, in a sense, as Holderlin said before, turned. Man not unhappily measures himself against the Godhead. So man turning toward God and saying, I wish to be like God. And that kind of longing of the spontaneous longing of the heart. That's what we're talking about with the upward glance, which passes aloft toward the sky, and yet it remains below on the earth. The upward glance spans the between of sky and earth. So we can read that in a literal way, or we can read it in more of a poetic way, maybe, right? Spanning the between of my reality, mortal existence, and the divinity, or eternity. The upward glance spanning the distance between those two, which is an infinite distance. This between is measured out for the dwelling of man. We now call the span thus meted out the dimension. And the dimension, does not arise from the fact that sky and earth are turned toward one another. Rather, they're facing each other itself depends on the dimension. Nor is the dimension a stretch in space. For everything spatial is already in need of the dimension, that is, that into which it is admitted. So to remember what we talked about earlier, man is, the fundamental thing about man is that he's dwelling. And to dwell, we need to build a dwelling place. Okay. So this is talking about building the dwelling place. What Heidegger is calling the dimension is the dwelling place. And it's simply just the stretch, the span between sky and earth. Or the span between mortal earthly existence and eternal divine existence. Okay. Any questions about that point before we move on?
So, if I have this right, the dwelling of man is the dimension which is built by man looking up.
So far.
Okay.
But he's going to add more. Okay. And if we can continue, the nature of the dimension.
Okay. The nature of the dimension is the meeting out, which is lightened and so in the span of the between, the upward to the sky as well as the downward to earth. We leave the nature of the dimension without a name. According to Holderlin's words, man spans the dimension by measuring himself against the heavenly. Man does not undertake this spanning just now and then. Rather, man is man at all only in such spanning. This is why he can indeed block this spanning, trim it, and disfigure it, but he can never evade it. Man, as man, has always measured himself with and against something heavenly. Lucifer, too, is descended from heaven. Therefore we read in the next lines, 28 to 29, man measures himself against the Godhead. This Godhead is the measure with which man measures out his dwelling, his stay on the earth beneath the sky. Only insofar as man takes the measure of his dwelling in this way is he able to be commensurately with his nature. Man's dwelling depends on the upward-looking measure-taking of the dimension, in which the sky belongs just as much as the earth.
This measure taking not only takes the measure of the earth, ge, which the Greek word for earth, and accordingly it is no mere geometry. Just as, okay, so that's just Heidegger's little wordplay. Earth measuring. Just as little does it ever take the measure of heaven, Uranos, for itself. Measure taking is no science. Measure taking gauges the between, which brings the two, heaven and earth, to one another. This measure taking has its own metron, and thus its own metric. Okay, just forget about that. We'll come back to that. Man's taking measure in the dimension dealt out to him brings dwelling into its ground plan, into what's most essential, or what allows dwelling. So man taking measure of the dimension is what allows dwelling to what allows him to dwell. Taking the measure of the dimension is the element within which human dwelling has its security, by which it securely endures. The taking of measure is what is poetic in dwelling. Poetry is a measuring. But what is it to measure? If poetry is to be understood as measuring, then obviously we may not subsume it under just any idea of measuring and measure. Okay, if you'd like to go ahead with that.
Poetry is presumably a high and special kind of measuring, but there is more. Perhaps we have to pronounce the sentence, poetry is a measuring, with a different stress. Poetry is a measuring. In poetry there takes place what all measuring is in the ground of its being. Hence it is necessary to pay heed to the basic act of measuring. That consists in man's first of all taking the measure which then is applied in every measuring act. In poetry, the taking of measure occurs. To write poetry is measure-taking, understood in the strict sense of the word, by which man first receives the measure for the breadth of his being. Man exists as a mortal. He is called mortal because he can die. To be able to die means to be capable of death as death. Only man dies, and indeed continually, so long as he stays on this earth, so long as he dwells. His dwelling, however, rests in the poetic. Holderlin sees the nature of the poetic in the taking of the measure by which the measure-taking of human being is accomplished.
Okay. Any questions or comments at this point?
Could we use a different terminology here when we talk about taking a measure of? We could say understanding the limits of, say, human existence, or the limits of that indwelling.
You lose a lot doing that. Because measure, the nature of measure, it's a double word. It's a double meaning when you're talking about measures in poetry. So you're talking about breath, you're talking about rhythm. You're talking about actually almost in the blood of what it is to compose verse. And he's conscious of that when he's talking about measuring. He's talking about this kind of taking of limits and not so much limits, but actually taking boundaries and being giving life to that.
And also there isn't a full understanding in taking the measure of something. There's a perceiving, which is getting to understanding, but there are some things which are mysterious and some things are not.
Inevitably you leave somebody out, don't you? As a woman. and acknowledging it. So that's part of the dwelling too, is what's in and what's out, even in the act of measurement, and which presumably goes on and on and on.
Right.
There's not, we don't celebrate just one mass, we get it over and over, we exist in it, so.
Those are good points. I hadn't thought about that connection with measures and poetry. It's very good.
But we're going to Hopkins too.
Yeah.
But
Strong
something,
verse, so.
something that can be measured is something that has limits.
Right.
But we're measuring ourselves against Godhead. So we're recognizing, in the act of measuring, we're recognizing our limits as opposed to the limitless, the divine.
And as we're reconciling the fact that we are bound to measure even as we fail in the measure.
Yeah.
Or even as we can't encapsulate, we are bound to that act of dwelling and measuring within that fact of being.
These are great points.
It almost seems too that what he's saying is that you can't really, that even after someone dies, they are known by the poetic. It's almost to say that you can't know somebody simply by the intellect, but there's something about the poetic that would reveal this particular person, because the intellect would grasp that which is universal, whereas the poetic would grasp that which is personal or individual.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I think, yeah, there's something to that. And when he's talking here about, let's see, only man dies, to be able to die means to be capable of death as death. Now that's a very existentialist claim, right? Because part of what makes human being, the special being of human beings, the being of humans in the world special, is that we're conscious of what it means to be, and so we're conscious of what it means to cease to be. So only humans can die, in a sense, experience death as death. An animal will cease to exist, but it doesn't die in the same way. And so when we're talking about the measure taking of human being, it's a measuring of the earth against the sky, that dimension. Also, in a sense, it's a measuring of what it is to be versus what it is to cease to be. So a measure taking between life and death. That's also an essential aspect here. Okay, I'm going to read for a little while. Yet how shall we prove that Hölderlin thinks of the nature of poetry as taking measure? Okay, Heidegger says we do not need to prove anything here. All proof is always only a subsequent undertaking on the basis of presuppositions. Anything at all can be proved, depending only on what presuppositions are made. So, you may take that as you will. But we can here pay heed only to a few points. It is enough, then, if we attend to the poet's own words. For in the next lines, Hölderlin inquires, before anything else, and in fact exclusively, as to man's measure. That measure is the Godhead, against which man measures himself. The question begins in line 29, with the words, "Is God unknown?" Manifestly not, for if he were unknown, how could he, being unknown, ever be the measure? Yet, and this is what we must now listen to and keep in mind, for Hölderlin, God, as the one who he is unknown. And it is just as this unknown one that he is the measure for the poet. This is also why Hölderlin is perplexed by the exciting question, how can that which by its very nature remains unknown ever become a measure? For something that man measures himself by must after all impart itself, must appear. But if it appears, it is known. The God, however, is unknown, and he is the measure nonetheless. Not only this, but the God who remains unknown must, by showing himself as the one he is, appear as the one who remains unknown. Okay, does that make sense? So if God is by nature, and I'm not asserting this yet, but let's just say if the nature of God is as the unknown one, if God is by nature unknown, then by manifesting himself, showing himself as who he is, he must, in a way, manifest himself, make himself known as the unknown one. So God manifests himself as one who is unknown. Yes. So it's important to note here, Hölderlin was a pagan, but Heidegger was a Catholic. And then later in life he left the church. But he was deeply formed by St. Thomas Aquinas and by the Catholic philosophical tradition. And by the Catholic faith. I mean, he was a Catholic. Okay. God's manifestness, not only he himself, is mysterious. Therefore the poet immediately asks the next question. Is he manifest like the sky? Hölderlin answers, I'd sooner believe the latter. Why, so we now ask, is the poet's surmise inclined in that way? The very next words give the answer. They say tersely, it's the measure of man. Okay. And this is kind of the heart of the essay, I think. What is the measure for human measuring? God? No. The sky? No. The manifestness of the sky? No. The measure consists in the way in which the God, who remains unknown, is revealed as such by the sky. God's appearance through the sky consists in a disclosing that lets us see what conceals itself, but lets us see it not by seeking to wrest what is concealed out of its concealedness, but only by guarding the concealed in its self-concealment. Thus the unknown God appears as the unknown by way of the sky's manifestness. This appearance is the measure against which man measures himself. Okay. Yeah.
Do you think you
One question in the back.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
That just made me think of the way that Christ reveals himself in the Eucharist and yet remains
Yes.
concealed.
Yeah, isn't that marvelous? Yes. Okay.
Do you think Heidegger was a well-formed Catholic?
Well, yes. Well, I mean, he left the church, so I don't know, maybe. I think, from what I know about his early life, which isn't extensive, but, you know, he was in the seminary for a while. I mean, he was a seminarian. He was certainly broadly trained in philosophy and in the faith. And then he sort of, I think as he grew older, he became kind of entranced by modernist claims, and he ended up joining Lutheranism. And then I think maybe he just kind of fell away from Christian faith in general. So, but certainly I think he was well formed, but then sort of led astray. Yeah.
What do you make of that line? That measure is the Godhead, against which man measures himself. I'm still unsettled with it.
Where is that? Is that in the last
It's
paragraph you just read?
Oh, it's about a third of the way down. As to man's measure, and then he says that measure is the Godhead, against which man measures himself.
So are you looking for the antecedent of that?
Well, it's there. It's the measure.
I mean, I think that's Heidegger's claim, and he's claiming that it's
Yeah.
also Hölderlin's claim.
What? So it's both of their claims.
I think Heidegger is saying that I believe that was Hölderlin's claim as well.
Right.
Okay.
He's just explicating what he believes is in Hölderlin's poem. Right. In one of the passages we skipped over earlier, Heidegger goes into this a little aside where he talks about how, what does he say? We can think the same thing that Hölderlin is saying poetically, even though we arrive at it by a different way. That's kind of what he's trying to do with this whole essay. So he's trying to philosophically arrive at the same thing that Hölderlin arrives at from his poem. Kind of build that up. Anyway, okay. Any other questions or comments about this claim we just made? This is it. I mean, this is the fundamental claim from this essay, that God's appearance through the sky consists in a disclosing that lets us see what conceals itself, and lets us see it not by seeking to wrest what is concealed out of its concealedness, but only by guarding the concealed in its self-concealment. Okay.
It's like a tongue twister.
Yeah, it's typical of Heidegger, or the German language in general.
I mean, I
Yeah.
can't help but read that passage and think about, for example, the Greeks were not, they had a religion, as it were, but they were also deeply steeped in the intellectual tradition of Platonism and Aristotelian thought. And when Paul arrived in Greece, he found, amongst other things, within their religion, they had set up a temple to the unknown God, and that was actually what it was called. But for the Greeks, and anyone who knew Plato, knew exactly what that meant.
Sure.
It meant that the Greeks had figured out through the use of natural reason that there could not in fact be multiple gods. That there had to be one God.
Right.
And they figured that out hundreds of years before Christian revelation. And the other side is that revelation in the Old Testament of God who says, I am who am. And he reveals himself in an unknown way, under a veil. There's always this veiling that occurs. And so there's this revelation through a secondary source of that Godhead. And I'm wondering whether or not the intellect itself provides the veiling, as it were, and the ability to know that which is unknown. Because the Greeks demonstrated that, actually.
Oh. That's very good.
So you can't say that they actually had a revelation, but they had already figured it out. And that's what I think he's alluding to, that measurement of the sky.
Yeah. Well, St. Thomas asserts that by reason we can prove that God exists, and he provides the proofs, So by reason we can certainly determine the existence of God and we can determine even some attributes of God, but without really, without attaining any of the truths provided through divine revelation.
Vatican I backing up dogmatically.
Right. Yeah, you're right.
So how is he thinking the sky reveals God as unknown?
Yeah.
It's a mechanism that leads me.
I think that he's commenting on an experience of not necessarily natural revelation, but if anyone, I'm sure many of us in this room have had the experience where something sort of happens that we didn't expect or did not work for, and we feel something of the divine in that experience. For instance, and this is as bad as it's not something that you work for, but for me, if I'm at a high place, like say I've been on a hike and I'm at a high place, and I look down and I see the enormity of the world, and I feel the fear of being up that high, that nature can kill me at any moment. That in some ways is an experience of God. Or to use a more commonplace example, I usually have there are experiences that happen, around the Eucharist itself. Not usually when I take it, but around it. And he's not trying to get something that's necessarily something just like this is exactly what it is, because it's a poetic experience, and the minute you do that, you're losing you lose part of the experience.
Yeah.
And I think also that whole concept of measuring, you can measure the earth. The earth itself is measurable. The atmosphere is measurable, but the sky is not measurable. Just the very emotional or intuitive understanding that the sky is immeasurable is a glimpse of the divine.
We can get a little bit better understanding. I think if we go on, it might be on the next page of your handouts. There's an indented section that says, "What is God?" It's a quote from the poem. "What is God, unknown yet, full of his qualities, as the face of the sky?" So if you can see that, then in the paragraph beneath that, Heidegger goes on to say, right, "What remains alien to God is what is familiar to man." What is that? Everything that shimmers and blooms in the sky, and thus under the sky, and thus on earth. Everything that sounds and is fragrant, rises and comes, but also everything that goes and stumbles, moans and falls silent, pales and darkens. Into this, which is intimate to man, but alien to the God, and he's speaking here using Hölderlin's terms, right? We wouldn't, in a Christian context, we wouldn't say that creation is alien to God in any way because of the incarnation, okay? But what is intimate to man but alien to God, the unknown imparts himself in order to remain guarded within it as the unknown. But the poet calls all the brightness of the sights of the sky and every sound of its courses and breezes into the singing word, and there makes them shine and ring. Yet the poet, if he is a poet, does not describe the mere appearance of sky and earth. The poet calls in the sights of the sky that which in its very self-disclosure causes the appearance of that which conceals itself, and indeed as that which conceals itself. In the familiar appearances, the poet calls the alien as that to which the invisible imparts itself, in order to remain what it is, unknown. So maybe that it's. I don't think there's maybe a direct, rational or logical apparatus here. I mean, ironically, even in this is part of what we said earlier, that poetry resists adequate paraphrase. Heidegger is in a sense trying to paraphrase Hölderlin's poem. I mean, he's trying to draw this philosophical system or framework out of it, and we can follow him to a certain extent, but it's not entirely susceptible to reason. But we can kind of get the contours of what he's saying, I think, right? The unknown God reveals himself in a way where he remains unknown, but yet is immanent through creation. And that the poet, he says, if he is a poet in his writing, is not merely describing appearances, but he's actually invoking that immanent presence of God and causing that to be revealed, that should be represented in a certain way. That's how I read this section. Okay, any further comments or questions? There's more to this essay, of course, but I think we'll leave it at that because we're out of time. So if anybody has to go, feel free. Otherwise, I think we should go ahead and read the Wreck of the Deutschland. Okay. Right. Is anyone familiar with Hopkins? Has anyone read any Hopkins? Okay. Okay, good. So Hopkins is a great poet. I think he may be the greatest poet in the English language, although many would disagree. That's a matter of taste, But yeah, right. So yeah, okay, I'll give you that. Okay. He does some interesting things with language, which we'll find here. And it's he uses words in multiple ways, and there's lots of little tricks. He invents his own words. He uses nouns as verbs, lots of things like that. And he was quite ahead of his time. I mean, he uses some things that we might think of are more modern techniques. He was writing in the Victorian age. Right. Okay, so for that reason, I'm just going to read the poem, and so you can just follow along with the handout. And then if you'd like to discuss it afterwards, you're very welcome. Okay, so the Wreck of the Deutschland, dedicated to the happy memory of 5 Franciscan nuns, exiles by the Falk Laws. So they were exiled from Germany, seeking refuge in England, on a ship called the Deutschland, drowned between midnight and morning of December 7th, 1875. Thou mastering me, God, giver of breath and bread, world strand, sway of the sea, Lord of living and dead, thou hast bound bones and veins in me, fastened me flesh, and after it almost unmade, what with dread thy doing. And dost thou touch me afresh? Over again I feel thy finger and find thee. I did say yes, O with lightning and lashed rod. Thou heardst me truer than tongue confess thy terror, O Christ, O God. Thou knowest the walls, altar and hour and night, the swoon of a heart that the sweep and the hurl of thee trod hard down with a horror of height, in the midriff a strain with leaning of, laced with fire of stress. the frown of his face before me, the hurdle of hell behind. Where was a place? I whirled out wings that spell, and fled with a fling of the heart to the heart of the host, my heart. But you were dove-winged, I can tell, carrier-witted. I am bold to boast, to flash from the flame to the flame then, tower from the grace to the grace. I am soft sift in an hourglass, at the wall, fast, but mind with emotion adrift, and it crowds and it combs to the fall. I steady as a water in a well, to a poise, to a pain, but roped with always, all the way down, from the tall fells or flanks of the vole, a vein of the gospel proffer, a pressure, a principle, Christ's gift. I kiss my hand to the stars, lovely asunder, starlight, wafting him out of it, and glow, glory and thunder. Kiss my hand to the dappled with damson west, since though he is under the world's splendor and wonder, his mystery must be stressed. For I greet him the days I meet him, and bless when I understand. Not out of his bliss springs the stress felt, nor first from heaven, and few know this, swings the stroke dealt. Stroke in a stress that stars and storms deliver, that guilt is hushed by, hearts are flushed by and melt. But it rides time like riding a river, and here the faithful waver, the faithless fable and miss. It dates from day of his going in Galilee, warm-laid grave of a womb-life gray, manger, maiden's knee, the dense and the driven passion and frightful sweat, thence the discharge of it, there its swelling to be, though felt before, though in high flood yet. What none would have known of it, only the heart, being hard at bay, is out with it. Oh, we lash with the best or worst word last, how a lush-kept, plush-capped slow will mouthed to flesh burst, gush, flush the man, the being with it, sour or sweet, brim in a flash, full, hither then, last or first, to hero of Calvary, Christ's feet. Never asked it, meaning it, wanting it, warned of it. Men go. Be adored among men, God, three-numbered form. Ring thy rebel, dogged in den, man's malice with wrecking and storm. Beyond saying sweet, past telling of tongue, thou art lightning and love. I found it. Father and fondler of heart, thou hast rung, hast thy dark descending, and most art merciful then. With an anvil ding and with fire in him, forge thy will, or rather than stealing a spring through him, melt him, but master him still. Whether at once, as once at a crash, Paul, or as Austin, a lingering out sweet skill, make mercy in all of us, out of us all, mastery. But be adored, King. Some find me a sword, some the flange and the rail. Flame, fang, or flood goes death on drum, and storms bugle his fame. But we dream we are rooted in earth, dust. Flesh falls within sight of us. We, though our flower the same, wave with the meadow, forget that there must the sour scythe cringe, and the blear share come. On Saturday sailed from Bremen, American outward bound, take settler and seamen, tell men with women, 200 souls in the round. O Father, not under thy feathers, nor ever is guessing, the goal was a shoal, of a fourth the doom to be drowned. Yet did the dark side of the bay of thy blessing not vault them, the million of rounds of thy mercy not reeve even them in. Into the snows she sweeps, hurling the haven behind, the Deutschland on Sunday, and so the sky keeps, for the infinite air is unkind, and the sea flint-flake, black-backed in the regular blow, sitting east-northeast in cursed quarter, the wind, wiry and white-fiery in whirlwind-swiveled snow, spins to the widow-making, unchilding, unfathering deeps. She drove in the dark to leeward, She struck not a reef or a rock, but the combs of a smother of sand. Night drew her dead to the Kentish knot, and she beat the bank down with her bows in the ride of her keel. The breakers rolled on her beam with ruinous shock, and canvas and compass, the whirl and the wheel, idle forever to waft her or wind her with. These she endured. Hope had grown grey hairs. Hope had mourning on. Trenched with tears, carved with cares, hope was 12 hours gone. And frightful a nightfall folded rueful a day, nor rescue, only rocket and lightship shone, and lives at last were washing away. To the shrouds they took, they shook in the hurling and horrible airs. One stirred from the rigging to save the wild womankind below. With a rope's end round the man, handy and brave, he was pitched to his death at a blow. For all his dreadnought breast and braids of thew, they could tell him for hours, dandled the to and fro through the cobbled foam fleece. What could he do with the burl of the fountains of air, buck and the flood of the wave? They fought with God's cold, and they could not, and fell to the deck, crushed them, or water and drowned them, or rolled with the sea romp over the wreck. Night roared with the heartbreak, hearing a heart-broke rabble, the woman's wailing, the crying of child without check, till a lioness arose, breasting the babel. A prophetess towered in the tumult, a virginal tongue told. Ah, touched in your bower of bone are you, turn for an exquisite smart have you. Make words break from me here all alone to you, mother of being in me, heart. Oh, unteachably after evil, but uttering truth. Why? Tears, is it? Tears, such a melting, a madrigal start. Never eldering revel and river of youth. What can it be, this glee, the good you have there of your own? Sister, a sister calling a master, her master and mine. And the inboard seas run swirling and hauling, the rash smart sloggering brine blinds her. But she that weather sees one thing, has one fetch in her. She rears herself to divine ears, and the call of the tall nun to the men in the tops and the tackle rode over the storms brawling. She was first of a 5, and came of a coiffed sisterhood. O Deutschland, double a desperate name, O world wide of its good. But Gertrude, Lily, and Luther are 2 of a town, Christ's lily and beast of the waste wood. From life's dawn it is drawn down. Abel is Cain's brother, and breasts they have sucked the same. Loathed for a love men knew in them, banned by the land of their birth, Rhine refused them, Thames would ruin them. Surf, snow, river, and earth gnashed. But thou art above, thou Orion of light. Thy unchancelling poising palms were weighing the worth, thou martyr master. In thy sight, storm flakes were scroll-leaved flowers, lily showers. Sweet heaven was astrew in them. 5. The finding and sake and cipher of suffering Christ. Mark, the mark is of man's make, and the word of it, sacrificed. But he scores it in scarlet himself on his own bespoken, before time taken, dearest prized and priced, stigma, signal, cinquefoiled token, for lettering of the lamb's fleece, ruddying of the rose flake. Joy fall to thee, Father Francis, drawn to the life that died, with the gnarls of the nails in thee, niche of the lance, his lovescape crucified, and seal of his seraph arrival. And these thy daughters, and 5 livid and leavid, favor and pride, are sisterly sealed in wild waters, to bathe in his fall gold mercies, to breathe in his all-fire glances. Away in the lovable west, on a pastoral forehead of Wales, I was under a roof here, I was at rest, and they the prey of the gales. She to the black about air, to the breaker, the thickly falling flakes, to the throng that catches and quails, was calling, O Christ, Christ, come quickly. The cross to her she calls Christ to her, christens her wild worst, best. The majesty, what did she mean? Breathe, arch and original breath. Is it love in her, of the being as her lover had been? Breathe, body of lovely death. They were else minded then, altogether the men, woke thee with a we are perishing in the weather of Gennesaret. Or is it that she cried for the crown then, the keener to come at the comfort, for feeling the combating keen? For how to the heart's cheering the down-dugged, ground-hugged grey hovers off, the jay-blue heavens appearing of pied and peeled May, blue-beating and hoary glow height or night still higher, with belled fire and the moth-soft Milky Way. What by your measure is the heaven of desire? The treasure never eyesight got, nor was ever guessed what for the hearing. No, but it was not these, the jading and jar of the carts, time's tasking. It is fathers that asking for ease of the sodden with its sorrowing heart, not danger, electrical horror. Then further it finds the appealing of the passion is tenderer in prayer apart. Other, I gather, in measure, her mind's burden, in winds burly and beat of endragoned seas. But how shall I? Make me room there, reach me up, fancy, come faster. Strike you the sight of it, look at it loom there, thing that she... There then, the master. Ipse, the only one, Christ, King, Head. He was to cure the extremity where he had cast her. Do, deal, lord it with living and dead. Let him ride her pride in his triumph, dispatch and have done with his doom there. Ah, there was a heart right. There was single eye, read the unshapable shock night and knew the who and the why. Wording it how, but by him that present and past, heaven and earth are word of, worded by. The Simon Peter of a soul, to the blast, Tarpeian fast, but a blown beacon of light. Jesu, heart's light. Jesu, maid's son. What was the feast followed the night thou hadst glory of this none? Feast of the one woman without stain, for so conceived, so to conceive these done. But here was heart throe, birth of a brain, word that heard and kept thee, and uttered thee outright. While she has thee for the pain, for the patience, but pity for the rest of them. Heart, go and bleed at a bitterer vein for the comfortless, unconfessed of them. No, not uncomforted. Lovely felicitous providence, finger of a tender of, oh, of a feathery delicacy, the breast of the maiden could obey so, be a bell to ring of it, and startle the poor sheep back. Is the shipwreck then a harvest? Does tempest carry the grain for thee? I admire thee, master of the tides, of the yore flood, of the year's fall, the recurb and the recovery of the gulf sides, the girth of it and the wharf of it and the wall, staunching, quenching ocean of emotionable mind, ground of being and granite of it, past all, grasp God, throned behind death with the sovereignty that heeds but hides, bodes but abides, with a mercy that outrides the all of water and ark, for the listener, for the lingerer with a love glides lower than death and the dark. A vein for the visiting of the past prayer pent in prison, the last breath penitent spirits, the uttermost mark, our passion plunged giant risen, the Christ of the Father compassionate, fetched in the storm of his strides. Now burn, new-born to the world, double-natured name, the heaven-flung, heart-fleshed, maiden-furled miracle in Mary of flame. Mid-numbered he in three of the thunder throne, not a doomsday dazzle in his coming, nor dark as he came, kind, but royally reclaiming his own. A released shower, let flash to the shire, not a lightning of fire hard hurled. Dame at our door, drowned, and among our shoals, remember us in the roads, the heaven haven of the reward. our King back, oh, upon English souls. Let him Easter in us, be a day spring to the dimness of us, be a crimson cresseted east, more brightening her, rare dear Britain, as his reign rolls. Pride, rose, prince, hero of us, high priest, our hearts' charities, hearths, fire, our thoughts, chivalries, throngs, Lord.
Now I know why I wanted to do engineering.
Boy.
That's really nice.
That's great, Matthew, thank you.
Thank you for doing that.
Beautiful reading.
Did anyone notice any concepts from Heidegger as we read through that poem?
We were too long ago to remember.
I think the line that really jumped out at me in this reading was the grasp God thrown behind, and how that relates to the that key passage that you were talking about in Heidegger.
Right.
How the unknown God, who is the measure, reveals his unknownness, and by that unknownness is the measure.
Yeah, that's
God
absolutely
is grasped, but is still thrown behind. I think that is.
They fought with God's cold and they could not.
About, let's see, stanza number 5, at the very beginning, he says, since though he is under the world's splendor and wonder, his mystery must be stressed. So I think that's also kind of revealing of Hopkins' perspective. I think it's very similar to the perspective Heidegger was espousing. God is the unknown one, is present there under what is known. What is it? But his mystery must be, if you will, stressed. And that's a particular term Hopkins uses in other places.
What does Hopkins mean by stressed?
That is it. That's far too complicated for me to answer. I don't even understand. I don't know what he means by that. It's something related to, like we were talking about, revealing, the meaning of things. It's something like that,
So it's something along the lines of, it is stressed within you, it is revealed to you or grasped by you in an internal sense.
Well, perhaps more like a stress in a poem, or like a stress on an accent. I think that's maybe more what he means. Like, if you can imagine, if you could put a stress on a thing, or like if you could accent something in creation, like if you could accent a chair, So you accent it, you're stressing it, and it's like an act of consciousness. It's bringing something out of it.
Indwell.
Yeah.
But at the
Well,
same,
that yeah.
But at the same time, it just confused me because he says in stress, then stress, and that's my rational mind is saying, but those can't mean the same thing.
Hopkins scholars are still arguing about that.
Is that one of his words that he created?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah. Oh, very good. I've kept you all much later than you bargained for. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
All right. I suppose, should we close with a prayer, Father?
Yes, well, stay tuned. Next month, I forget who we have next month. I think next month we have Father John Arcidiacono coming up from Salem, and he's going to speak on philosophical contemplation on the existence of God.
Contemplation of the existence of God?
Yeah, something like that.
Philosophical.
Stay tuned.
Of.
I'll clarify, and it'll be right when we advertise the event. Something like that.
Okay.
Finish with a prayer?
Yes, let's.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be,
world without end. Well, there's plenty of refreshments still over there, and please, do make a donation if you can to help support to help